This is a previously held live version of Working with Transgender Youth 101 on July 6th, 2020, that is recorded over. You will have the opportunity to hear the question and answer section at the end of this training, as well as another training at the second portion of this course.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Sansara Owens. I am with the KVC Kansas training team. I'm really, really grateful to be asked into this training, working with transgender youth. I call it a 101. You'll see that, and I'll explain that a little bit more. And then I'm so grateful to also be able to have one of my colleagues and longtime friends here as well to talk to us. So just a little background on me. I'm a licensed master social worker with about 8 years of experience talking about some of these topics. So, like I said before, I love questions. I don't mind being interrupted. I really appreciate that. I'm going to kick off kind of a presentation, but before I start that, I just want to introduce who else is with me. And I will let him introduce himself, but this is Jamie, and it's on to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie. I'm a licensed social worker here in Illinois. So that means that I'm not in the state with you all. But Sansara has asked me to help tag team with this training. I am an out transgender person who also works in clinical social work out here in Illinois. So that being said, I've done a lot of work with transgender youth, transgender adults, parents of transgender people, transgender youth who are just kind of beginning to question, and allies, and all of the above. So, I mean, I'll kind of pop in a little bit later for us to chat a little bit more, but that's my general introduction. So.
Thanks, Jamie. So if there's no starting questions, I will probably just pop into the presentation. And then at the end, there's a couple points in the presentation where I'll stop and say, like, let's have some questions here, let's have some discussion here. But specifically at the end, he'll hear more from Jamie. You'll be able to ask him some questions as well as me. And we can kind of go from there. I really want to make this applicable to all of you in the work that you're doing. So that, like I said, I love those questions, those pop-ins, because I'm here to help you kind of like navigate this new language, this new world. So any questions now before I turn off my video and put the presentation up? Okay, I'm going to turn off my video. Jamie, you're welcome to install, and then I'm going to put the microphone up. Sorry, with WebEx, it takes like 14 steps. Shout out if this disappears. I know sometimes that happens. So this is, as you see here, Working with Transgender Youth 101. And so really, the reason why I call this a 101 is because this is an ever-evolving discussion. The ways in which I started this conversation, a decade ago, 8 years ago, 5 years ago, it was very different than what the conversations we're having now. And so I really appreciate that, and am grateful that I'm invited into this conversation, and hope that we can continue to have more. Like Sarah mentioned earlier, there is a more comprehensive training, like an introduction to LGBTQIA youth, like working with those identified youth. But this one is a pretty comprehensive training on its own, and it's more of a subset, I guess. If somebody took that training from me previously, you'll recognize a video here, a slide here, but I tried to tailor this pretty specifically with working with transgender youth. I am always available for questions. I actually had another staff member from the hospital side reach out to me and ask me for some questions working with a client who identifies as transgender, looking for resources in a rural area. And it was like just the best project that I could get in my lap. So I'm really excited to be available for that. Just a little bit of our agenda today. We're going to start with a glossary of terms. I think that's really important so that we have a foundation of language to continue this conversation together. So at first, there's a little bit of me just kind of talking at you, which is frustrating, I know. But then we're going to talk about why this is important, and then how we as individuals can help. if we were in a room together, I would do this activity, but since we're not, and it'd be a little clunky through kind of just the setup that we have right now, I normally would just have you introduce yourself, the name you go by, your position, and a fun fact about yourself. So if you just want to take a moment and smile at the people around the room and nod, because I know you've probably all have done that activity in your own room numerous times. It's a little weird doing a training to people that I, but really would appreciate you all being vulnerable and asking questions as we go, because this is meant to be like a safe learning environment, a space where we can have these conversations so we can grow from them together. So just to start off with a glossary of terms, I like to start out saying that we are really only talking about some of the dimensions of our identity. So our identity is made up of all of these parts, right? Race, our physical ability, our education status, our family structure, not just our own dimensions, but our clients' families. Today we're primarily talking about these four dimensions here: gender identity, sex, sexual orientation, and gender expression. So we're really largely focusing on these dimensions, though primarily gender identity and gender expression. Has anybody, well, I like to ask this question and look around the room, but I can't see y'all nodding. But if anybody has heard of the term SOGI, look around your room and kind of nod or look confused. SOGI is a term that stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. SO, sexual orientation, gender identity, GI, and gender expression, GE. So we're going to be talking about this a little bit, but sometimes when people are having this conversation about LGBTQIA folks, we talk about they're presenting SOGI. So that's something that we might throw around a little bit here. I don't really see it outside of training or academia circles, but I think it's helpful, instead of me saying the phrase sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression every single time, it gets a little overwhelming to hear all of those words kind of thrown together. But that's what SOGI stands for. So we're talking here, here's kind of just like a basic example of a spectrum that we're going to be talking about. So instead of a gender binary, which means composed of two parts, we're talking about a spectrum. So this one shows kind of a simplified spectrum of homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, homo being the Greek foundation word of, the same, where hetero is the other, and so bi meaning two. So really just finding roots in our language that we already use every day. Biological sex, gender identity. So biological sex, how somebody is assigned at birth, what sex they are assigned at birth. And here we have female, intersex, and male. Often we hear some of the two parts that doctors are assigning babies, right? Female and male. However, intersex individuals it's approximated that they make up 1.7% of the population in the USA. And so some people say that's as common as redheads. And I think that's so significant, not because of the way we throw that around, but because that is a large number of the population of individuals who are being born with either or both reproductive organs or genitals of what doctors are assigning as female and what doctors are assigning as male. And so that the medical industry has decided of this gender binary. Gender identity is about how somebody identifies the gender that this person is identifying as. And so here there's male to, man to woman to genderqueer. And don't worry, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. I'm just kind of giving some basic definitions here. And I know I'm talking fast. I'm pretty sure the caffeine just kicked in. Lastly is gender expression. So how somebody expresses their gender, which could be with a masculine representation, a feminine representation, androgynous. Lots more words that I can use here. This is just kind of that starting point of spectrum. Do we have any questions about some of these ideas of these definitions of sexual orientation, biological sex, gender identity, or gender expression? I'll move forward. I'm sure many of you have heard of the letters LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA, lots of letters in there. In the more comprehensive training, I do talk about each of those in depth. There's also LGBTQIPPA. So there's a lot of letters we can talk about, but for the purpose of this training, we'll focus a lot more on the difference between LGB and T. So LGB, lesbian, gay, and bisexual, is really connotating somebody's sexual orientation, how they orient themselves to somebody else, an attraction of somebody else, whether that's physical, romantic, intellectual, etc. So how somebody orients themselves, LGB, versus somebody's gender identity, how somebody identifies their gender, the T standing for transgender in that acronym. Before I continue talking a little bit more about what transgender and some of those other related terms are, I'd like to go over what I call a no-no list, just so, again, we can kind of have a foundation for language and conversation together. So here are some outdated, alienating, and offensive terms and language and phrases. So I am going to say some of these out loud, and I'm going to use them once and try not to use them again because of the nature of some of them. For example, outdated and offensive language is transsexual, transvestite, and tranny. In some medical circles, you will still see transsexual. However, that is highly inappropriate for anybody in our positionality to use. Transsexual was previously used to denote a person who chose to transition their gender through medical means, whether that be surgery or hormones. However, it is widely recognized that individuals can identify as transgender with or without medical intervention, and transsexual has since dissipated from current usage. If somebody identifies as a transsexual, that is their personal preference. And something that they are allowed to say about themselves. Transvestite and tranny are both highly offensive and language that should never, ever be used as derogative. Those are derogative slurs. In that same line, additionally derogatory and highly offensive are the pronouns he, she, or it. So calling somebody a he, she, or saying that about somebody, or referencing a human individual as it, those are just absolutely denying somebody's human and not respecting their dignity and worth. So that is something that I often see in videos online and in articles, or people even sometimes trying to joke when they feel uncomfortable or they don't know. So it's highly problematic to call somebody he, she, or call somebody it. And I think hearing it in this conversation, it makes sense. However, when we hear other people using it, we should also have that same reaction. I skipped this, but just assumptions around soji. And so this is something that can be really alienating to people as well as offensive and considering like our clientele, their parents, their family, but making assumptions around their sexual orientation, their gender identity, and gender expression. So again, when we hear it said, it sounds often like common sense, right? If we have somebody assume what gender our partner is, or what sexual preference we have, or how we identify, it makes us uncomfortable ourselves. The same goes, if not more, for individuals who identify out of the gender binary, or don't identify as they were assigned at birth. So it's really important to work on challenging our own assumptions and try to adapt our language. And don't worry, we'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to do that. But this is just something to keep in mind as we start looking at approaching our clients in a new way. So then I'm going to continue on this list, and then I'm going to open up a little bit more for some questions about language and definitions. But so something that some people have heard and some people have not, depending on what circles you are in, but is dead name. And a dead name, and often our young people say this, so it's something that I want to bring up as you start seeing clients come in. But using somebody's dead name or their legal name only, their birth name, is a way to alienate someone, to offend them by not using the name that they have presented as their own. This can also be really scary for some folks if you're using a dead name or legal name, because it can out them in a way that they are not ready for. Similarly, I have here using trans hyphen unless self-identified. So if you were to reference somebody trans man or a trans woman, if they identify as a man or a woman, that is highly inappropriate because then you are outing them without that consent or permission. So unless they have self-identified as being transgender or trans man or trans woman, or unless they have given you consent to tell other individuals that they identify as transgender, then it is similarly not your place and can be really offensive or alienating to that clientele. So these are things to keep in mind. We will be talking about alternatives to doing this because I know that all of us social workers have a ton of paperwork. So we're going to talk about that too. So this is, again, just kind of going over some of our language basics. Some last ideas about ways that we can push away or offend clientele is gendered or normative phrasing. And this is just referencing, like, automatically assuming if you're talking to someone who identifies as a woman, you're automatically assuming, it's like, what is your boyfriend's name? Or when are you going to get pregnant? Those are just assuming that people have kind of this identity or plan that is of this majority or what's presented as the majority, or quote unquote normal. And then lastly, requesting details of sex life, surgical status, or genitals. Again, it sounds common sense. However, one of the number one things that gets reported by LGBTQIA individuals is that when they come out, the first thing that their straight or cisgender individual people who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, those people's first responses are, oh, who do you have sex with? What kind of genitals do you have? Are you going to have surgery? Are you going to do hormones? Which is just preposterous when you think about, like, oh, I just met this person at work. I'm not just going to ask her what her genitals look like. However, that is one of the number one boundary crosses that LGBTQIA report receiving from their friends and colleagues. So I know I talked a lot at you. I think this is often sometimes a good time to just offer some open space for people to ask questions because some of these prompt words that we've read or wondering why something is outdated. So if anybody wants to pop in with a question here, you're welcome to.
Hey, this is Phil over at Niles. I do have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
So the one we have with gender normative phrasing. So I guess my question is, do you typically have just feedback where it's just common just to have those conversations and referencing, just normality when you have conversation with those individuals about their orientation? So if I'm talking to a staff member or a coworker about, if they're dating, not in a personal conversation, just normality, what they're doing, if they're hanging out or whatever. It's just normal to ask, are you married? Do you have children? Those type of things. And it's not that you're purposely trying to be nosy, it's just normal conversation. And so I think sometimes that can be misperceived. And, it's not that you're trying to, be nosy, but maybe sometimes people may take it the wrong way.
I think that's a great question. And honestly, the way you presented the questions are really beautiful, right? Oh, are you married? Are you partnered? Do you plan on having children? Is different than automatically assuming because somebody is male that they have a female partner, or automatically assuming that because someone is female that they have the ability to or capacity to give birth. So I think it's more about the phrasing. I don't think there's anything wrong that to having those personal, conversations. Like we kind of need those to be able to do the work we do. So I agree with you that that is not necessarily nosy. It's part of normal conversations. It's more about the assumptions behind the language. So automatically assuming that somebody, because they present a certain way, that they have a certain partner, a certain gender identity, or sexual orientation. So I think having broader, less specific questions like, oh, are you married? Or, oh, do you have a family at home? Those questions are beautiful and can be really inclusive. So it's more about the gendered specific phrasing that I'm referencing.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, like I said, jump in with questions with, interruptions, no worries, but I'll kind of move forward a little bit. So here is the term, we're going to talk about transgender. So here are some of those I said germs, gender terms. But so the gender binary, so the categorization of gender into two distinct opposite sexes, right? Male, female. So that binary, two parts. Trans or transgender is sometimes an umbrella term applied to those whose gender identity is not the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. Cisgender is someone who is not transgender. Cisgender is someone who does identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to have a video on that. Gender queer is a term that is often applied to individuals who do not identify within the gender binary. Sometimes you can hear some of these terms be gender queer, gender fluid, gender non-binary, non-binary. There's a lot of terms that kind of fall here that it's really about respecting how the individual identifies. So especially with young people who are so creative that their imagination is just so often uninhibited, this is really a space for us to lean into that. And lastly, one of the terms is transition. So sometimes this term is used for the process of somebody changing their gender expression to match their gender identity, whether that includes surgical, hormones, or medical intervention. So a gender transition is often used. And so I'm going to talk now or have a little video about this term cisgender and let you hear from somebody else for a moment.
So let's talk a little about language and terminology. If I could just have a little asterisk flash imaginary here. Keep in mind that language and terminology is in a constant state of evolution, especially when we're looking at sexuality and gender. How things have changed over the past, I would say even 5 years, it's been pretty rapid, right? So there's a new term that's coming up that many people ask me, what does this even mean? So maybe this isn't a video necessarily just for trans folks. I think this may be for everyone, all right? So the terms we're going to talk about are first, transgender versus being cisgender. When I say cisgender, that's spelled Cisgender, no space. Just like transgender, there's no space between it, right? So what are these? Why do we have these terms right now? What does it mean? So if we break things down, which I love to do because I'm a nerd like that, cis means aligned to one side. Trans means to cross. All right. So let's visualize this a little bit. You have here sex assigned at birth, and then you have your gender identity. Okay. Sex assigned at birth typically is just male or female. Some people may be indicated as intersex at birth, others are not. Then you have your gender identity, which could be man, it could be woman, it could be bigender. For Native American individuals, they could say use the terminology two-spirited, or you have non-binary identities that are not that of a man or a woman. So you have these two different areas. Okay. For someone who is cisgender, you're born sex sign at birth, woman, and your gender identity is female. Right? Your sex and your gender are aligned. You are cisgender. It's aligned to one side. Being transgender, for example, I was one assigned female, but my gender identity is male. So those are cross, to cross. I am transgender. Okay, so if you hear those words, that's what it means. If you see someone say cis male or trans male, the cis male would be someone born assigned male who identifies as a man. Trans male, born assigned female, identifies as a man. All right. So that's one thing we need to think about. The other thing we need to think about are pronouns. See an expansion of different pronouns that people use that are different than he or she. Most commonly now, what we see being used, especially for individuals who identify as non-binary, again, not identifying as a man or a woman specifically, we see people using they, them, and theirs. All right. These are beautiful pronouns. In fact, I like just using them in general because they're so freeing and it moves us from those labels of he and she. Now, what I see happening though is people try pushing back at me when I talk about respecting they, them, and their pronouns by saying that's just not grammatically correct. You cannot use they, them, and their form. Well, just so you know, the dictionaries are now recognizing that yes, you can grammatically use they, them, and their in the singular form. So that grammatical argument is not working anymore, right? It's a very freeing and powerful place. With pronouns, if you're unsure of a person's pronoun, you can not use a pronoun. If you know their name, you can use their name. You can use how are you doing, or if you feel that they're open, you can ask. I hope I don't offend you. I would just like to ask, what pronouns do you use? Right. So ask them a question, but always preface it in a way like so you're not coming off as the attacker, right? If you make a mistake with pronouns, which you will do, I make a mistake with pronouns. It's important to be able to acknowledge your mistake and apologize, right? You may not recognize it right away that when you first do it, but maybe you remember it later, like, oh no, I used the wrong pronoun with that person. When you see them again, say, hey, I just really want to apologize. I recognize that I used the wrong pronoun with you, and I'm working on it. All right. Those little steps and those apologies make a world of difference for individuals who use different pronouns than what either you would assume or what you may have known previously. It shows that you're working on it and that you see them and you hear them and you're affirming them.
Any questions about this video from Ryan Salins? I'd love to hear from folks if they have any questions or a takeaway, just hearing Ryan Salins talk. Something that I think is really important that he mentions is the singular use of they, them, and how sometimes people, will present that grammatical kind of argument, which I've been in scenarios where I have actually said to individuals, like, it's so interesting to me that grammar trumps the dignity and worth of an individual. However, it is also true that just recently, at the end of last year, actually, in October 2019, the APA, the American Psychological Association, announced that they endorse the use of the singular they pronoun. So it's officially good practice in scholarly writing to use the singular they. In that article, they also talk about all other third gender pronouns, which we are not going to talk about today. We are primarily going to focus on she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, their pronouns. But I just want to note that some of those pronouns in the APA's article about the singular they mention zir, zir, they, ze, they, xe, here, hir, here, per, they, ve, aey, and hen, hen. So some of you might be like, what are pronouns, right? So pronouns really they matter. They're personal, they're important. They're not just a preference, even though sometimes we ask, what is your pronoun preference? This is about somebody's identity and how they identify. So pronouns are used in everyday speech and writing to take the place of people's names. And so many times we use them without even thinking. Mistaking or assuming people's pronouns without asking first is mistaking their gender. So using everyone's correct pronouns is a sign of respect and helps create a more inclusive environment. So when I started doing this work 9 or so years ago, one of the things that I worked on myself is really kind of checking when I would assume gender to people that I didn't know. For example, if I was in the store, the cashier or the clerk, referencing that person as they, them pronouns. So handing them the credit card, handing them the coupon, instead of, or, a server at a restaurant, the mail person, etc. So starting there with myself and my own internal processing really helped me in regards to not assuming gender pronouns when working with clients, when working with staff, colleagues, etc. So that way I could kind of work on what's going on in my brain before putting it into practice. So some examples of how we use these pronouns we have here. Meet Andre, she is the dog owner. The dog loves playing catch with her. The dog's hers. Meet Pat, he's a student. Schoolwork's interesting to him. Math is a favorite subject of his. Or meet Jesse. They are a doctor. Being a doctor is important to them. Pediatrics is a specialty of theirs. So those are just some examples in which we use pronouns and what we mean by pronouns. And like I said, for the purpose of this training, we're focusing on she, her, hers, he, him, his, and they, them, theirs. There are numerous other possibilities of pronouns, some of which I spelled or set out earlier. And so it's all about respecting the pronouns presented to you by your client or coworker or colleague. So I just threw this Mean Girls meme in here. Oh my God, Karen, you can't just not ask someone what their preferred gender pronoun is. Just kind of a light, funny way to think about it, but still very important. If we were in a room right now, all together, what I usually do in this training is have everybody introduce themselves with, using myself as an example. Hello, my name is Sansara. My pronouns are she, her, hers. What are yours? And turn to the person next to me and ask for those pronouns. However, in reality, that isn't always best practice, only in the sense that we can't, we might be putting people on the spot to announce their preferred pronouns. I have a colleague that I work in social justice elements here in Lawrence who is not out at work, uses different pronouns out of work, and then uses different pronouns when in social justice work and organizing spaces. So it depends on that individual's level of safety, that person's level of trust with the person they're talking to. It doesn't mean that the person is lying to you or not being trustworthy. It means that that person is recognizing where they have the ability and the capacity to be heard and listened to and trusted. So sometimes young people might introduce themselves to us with a certain pronoun, and then later inform us that they want to be, have different pronouns used. So I'm tempted to just have the groups in each room take a few minutes, but I'm unable to kind of really listen because of how we're sitting. So what I'm going to do instead is challenge everybody. You can do this with somebody you're in the room with right now, or a different colleague somewhere in your living space, your personal or professional space, to introduce yourself with your pronouns. If it's somebody in this room, I think it would be really great to then ask for their pronouns. If not, then I think it's acceptable to introduce yourself with your own pronouns. So this week I was a part of a big organizing event here in Lawrence, and so that was something that I really modeled to people. I was like, oh, hi, I'm Samsara, my pronouns are she, hers. And that showed individuals I was working with that not only do I respect people's pronouns or that I have the capacity to, but that I wanted them to be able to share theirs if they felt comfortable doing so. So what I'm asking you to, and I'm gently challenging you to do this week at some time, is introduce yourself with your pronouns. So, hi, my name is Samsara. My pronouns are she, hers. Or you can say, hi, my name is Samsara. My pronouns that I use are she, her, and hers. What are yours? Or what are your pronouns? So those are some ways in which you can ask. Do you have any questions about that? Like asking about pronouns, what pronouns are, third gender pronouns, non-binary pronouns, any of those things?
This is KBC Niles. We have a question.
Yes, please.
My question is, would it be appropriate to do that to our clients?
I think that's a really great question. I think that you know your own client best, probably. We, like KBC Kansas side, it has updated their intake paperwork to include pronouns and things like that. So that way we're showing our capacity for, having that conversation. I think a lot of the younger generation knows what pronouns are. Like they're willing to have that conversation. They're used to having this announced in classrooms, where a lot of like the older generations, like this isn't common practice, right? So you kind of know your own clients best. So I think if you're unsure, it's a good way to start with just your name and your own pronouns, or to say that and say to even just say, oh, what are your pronouns? Or because you also might be asked, what is that? What does that mean? And so then it's a good place to reference like yourself. It's like, oh, I use she, hers when people reference me. So sometimes people don't always know how to answer that. The other thing I didn't say that I meant to say is that it's really important that we're also not referencing them as like they don't matter. When I heard some people say like, oh, it doesn't matter, you can say whatever whatever you want. However, this really strongly matters to a large number of people, so we don't want to invalidate someone's real lived experience by saying it doesn't matter to us when for them it might really dictate their own level of safety in the world. So that's not a reference to your question, but that just prompted me to remember that. But so for clients, I think that follow your instincts, but this could be a really powerful, impactful way for the intake process. And I think maybe Jamie later can talk about how they have adapted that intake process or with pronouns with their own paperwork from their side, and I'll share how some of KBC has as well. But I think it is a really great way to include that. But also nuancing and recognizing that sometimes young people can be honest about their preferred pronouns if they're alone, but maybe not honest in front of parents or caregivers. Is that helpful? I feel like I gave you 3 answers in one.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. Any other questions coming up about pronouns or they, them pronouns? Um, any anything from the video earlier or definitions? Because we're about to move on from definitions. That doesn't mean you can't always continue having, these questions, but I just want to give that opportunity for people to ask about those. Okay, so we talk a little bit about coming out as far as definitions. I've referenced this a few times. I'm almost 90% certain people have heard of the phrase coming out or coming out of the closet, but it is referencing the process by which someone accepts and identifies with their gender identity and or sexual orientation, and then shares their identity willingly with others. So this graphic is from the It Gets Better project, or no, yeah, you can kind of see it at the bottom. Sorry, there, as well as the Safe Zone project. So these are all free resources. I have a resource kit at the end that I can provide to you. But I like what they say here. It says sometimes we talk about coming out as if it were a one-time thing. But for most folks, coming out, it's a series of decisions, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times a day, that LGBTQIA people navigate in every setting they enter. So there's this part under the green where it says people may be out in some spaces and quote unquote in others. Perhaps they're out to friends but not family, out to religious or out to classmates or coworkers but not to religious community. So a decision to come out to a person or a group is one of safety, comfort, trust, and readiness. So this is just a reminder that it's dangerous, unhealthy, and unhelpful to force someone to come out or to out someone else. So that means not discussing someone's gender identity or sexual orientation to others without that person's consent, regardless of your intention. So sometimes people think they're being helpful and acting on that person's behalf to conquer their fears or, pave the way or whatever those intentions are. However, if we do not have permission for that outing, then it can be very dangerous and unhealthy. And so this has some do's and don'ts. So if someone comes out to you, don't respond with "I always knew" or downplay the significance of their sharing with you. This sometimes can be well intended, like a show of support. However, it can often invalidate that person's choice to share with you, right? That it can kind of shut them down to feel like, oh, well, if you already knew, why did I take this risk? Don't go tell everybody else, like bragging about your new gay or trans friend. Don't forget that there's still the person you knew, befriended, or loved before, and don't ask questions or cross personal barriers you wouldn't have crossed earlier. So this is that example of don't ask about their genitals, don't ask what hormones they're taking, don't ask how they engage in sex with another partner, and then don't assume you know why they came out to you. So some do's are, know that this is a huge sign of trust. And then check in on how confidential this information is. Do other people know? How do you want me to refer to you? Like, what pronouns do you want me to use when I introduce you? Those kinds of things. Remember that their gender and sexuality is just one dimension of many of them. It does not define them. Show interest and curiosity about this part of them they're sharing with you in an appropriate way, and then ask how you can best support them. Sometimes it is just listening, right? That they don't necessarily want you to go lead the way and tell people how to talk to them or anything like that. They just want to know that they have a safe space. So we have this is just a little graphic. It says she's too young to decide to be a girl. Said no one ever to the cisgender girl, right? So this is something like we are being asked to think about is like flipping the script, so to speak. So it's not just that somebody can't identify a certain way, or this is like where people come in like, oh, they're too young to know. It's just a phase, these ideas. However, and I think this statistic is really important to remember as all of us are working with young people. But the average age to recognize feeling different a different gender identity than the one you were assigned at birth is 5 to 8 years old. So 5 to 8 years old is when the average age of individuals to recognize they feel different, have a different gender identity than the ones they were given at birth. And then the average age for an individual to recognize that they're a different sexual orientation than the majority of, like heterosexual, is ages 3 to 12. So it's very young. However, due to systematic harm and lack of safety, the average age of coming out is between 17 and 25. So I think that's just like a fascinating statistic in like a really sad way, right? That it takes a decade to 2 decades to feel safe and comfortable and ready to come out to the individuals around us. So I'm actually going to move us into a little activity. So all of you will just, on a piece of scrap paper, on your phone, wherever you can, I'm just going to give us like 60 seconds for you to gather that like apparatus to write down, and then to write these things down. You're going to need to write down 5 names or 5 things. The first one is going to be the name of a close friend, somebody that knows you deeply. Number 2 is a family member. Number 3, write down a prize, possession, or material object that you love or keep around you often. Number 4 is a hobby or a passion of yours. Number 5 would be a dream job. And now this isn't something I'm going to see, somebody next to you isn't going to see, so you don't have to write down KVC. Write down any kind of dream job. So I'm going to be reading aloud a story where you're going to input these names or items into the story. And then I'm going to ask and have some space I want to hear some reflections. So you won't have to share what you wrote down, but I will want to hear from some folks about how the activity went for them. So again, if you want to write down a close friend, a family member, a prized possession or material item, a favorite hobby or passion of yours, and then your dream job. Okay, so I'm going to read this story. It is adapted from the Safe Zone Project. Please imagine that you're a little boy, about 5 to 8 years old, again, around the average age to recognize a feeling of being a different gender than assigned at birth, and you're hanging out with your number 1, your close friend. You're watching TV and you say, you wish you were Wonder Woman. Your number 1 asks, you mean like a superhero? And you explain further how you wish you were a woman like her. Your friend calls you an ugly name and tells you he won't ever hang out with you again. Cross that person off your list. Fast forward to high school. Those feelings haven't gone away, and you've started learning that there are terms for how you want to approach your gender. Transition and trans woman. You think it's the 21st century and I should really just be able to be myself. You decide to sit down with one of your closest family members, number 2, who responds by saying it's just a phase and you were born a boy and you have no other option. You know it's not just a phase, but by continuing to affirm your gender identity as female, number 2 refuses to talk to you. Cross that person off your list. Even more harmful, that family member tells the rest of your family, which makes it impossible for you to live at home any longer. Shortly after, while experiencing homelessness, you finally secure a bed at a women's shelter and have a sigh of relief. However, one night, a new volunteer refuses to allow you to enter the shelter because your name and gender identity of your lived experience do not match the ones on your ID. All of your clothes, toiletries, and more importantly, number 3, your prized possession, are all inside. Mark your prized possession off your list. A little further down the road, and life has gotten a little bit better. When you are visiting the local library, you see a poster for your favorite pastime and hobby, number 4, a passion of yours. You decide to check it out and go to a meeting. Afterwards, the president of the club approaches you and introduces himself. You start talking, but he interrupts to ask if he saw you at the local Pride parade recently. You excitedly say yes and authentically share about your identity as a trans woman and the local events you've helped coordinate, thinking it will help your newfound club. The president tells you that he respects your right to do what you want, but that the other members of the group wouldn't be comfortable. He asks you not to come back. Mark your passion off your list. Finally, later in life, you've managed to get your ideal job, number 5, and life is good. You're at work one day and have a picture of your partner and child on your desk. Your boss walks by and asks about them. You tell her who they are and how long the adoption process was. She says great and goes on her way. The next morning, you're invited into a meeting where your boss tells you that the company is downsizing and they'll have to let you go. Cross your dream job off your list. Now, this story is not meant to be a picture of every transgender person's story, but these examples are not remotely overly dramatic in comparison to what statistics we have seen. So, what I'd love to hear from you all is, what was this activity like? How did this make you feel, or what did it make you think of, like as you're listening to me tell this story? And I'm definitely going to wait for people to speak up this time.
Someone in here just said it made them feel isolated.
Yeah, isolated.
This is KBC Now. Someone said just feeling unaccepted.
Yeah, unaccepted. Was anybody surprised or not surprised at some of the ideas that we have to kind of like think about, or what, who's included on this list that we had to write down and announce or cross off the list? Sometimes some of the responses I get here are, well, my close friend or my family or I wrote down would never do that to me, right? Like, would never denounce me in that way. However, we are going to look at some statistics which are, I guess to just prepare you, are a little disheartening about those numbers. While we may not feel like we would experience that, I think it's important to remember how many people do and would. I'm going to talking about our next portion of this. It's like, why does this matter, right? The number of transgender teens in the U.S. are on the rise. Teens identifying as transgender or gender nonconforming are more prevalent than people think. Some national insights. Why do trans people need more visibility? We have statistics such as from the Gender Violence and Resource Access Survey, finding that 50% of trans people have been raped or assaulted by a romantic partner. Trans people of color are 6 times more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with the police than white cisgender survivors of violence, which includes 77% of people who identify as trans experiencing assault from police officers or law enforcement. 80% of trans students feel unsafe at school because of their gender expression. This said 58.7% of gender nonconforming students have experienced verbal harassment in the past year because of their gender expression, compared to 29% of their peers. and 49% of trans people reported physical abuse through school systems. Additionally, 50% of students are unable to use a restroom that aligns with their gender identity at school. I can't even imagine not using the restroom for 8 hours in a day. 41% trans people have attempted suicide, and 1 in 5 transgender people have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. So those are just some statistics here. Additionally, just focusing in on transgender youth who are rejected by their families are more than 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. 78% of transgender students in grades K through 12 report harsh harassment, with 35 reporting physical assault and 12% reporting sexual violence. 15% of transgender students leave school in K through 12 settings or higher education due to the extremity of harassment, and half of those who leave school report experiencing homelessness. Transgender youth who could use their chosen home, school, work, and with friends, so in 4 contexts, had the lowest levels of mental health problems. Now, this graphic is so crucial as part of this training because if you look at the 2 gray bars, right, the light gray means having their chosen name used in 0 to 1 context, the dark gray in 2 to 3 contexts, and then the orange chosen name in all 4 contexts, right? So we have these gray bars barely changing that these transgender youth chosen name being used, right, is high in severe depression, suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior. It is not cut in half until their chosen name is used in all 4 contexts of homeschool, work, and with friends. So I've seen another statistic that I trust saying that using a transgender individual's name and pronoun reduces their likelihood of suicidal behavior by 56%. And that's why we're having this conversation. This is why having this conversation with you all matters. Using the use name and pronoun, like how crucial that is. While there's more things we can do, this is like the biggest takeaway I want you to have from this conversation. Some just statistics within child welfare, LGBTQ youth are disproportionately represented in the foster care system, right? If it's estimated that these statistics are for 2015, so it's even higher now for my last statistics in 2019. But if the general population has 7.2% LGBTQ identified kids in foster care, over 10%, and if there is 2.5% of transgender identified kids in general population, it's estimated that 5.6% are trans identified kids within the foster care system. So absolutely disproportionate numbers here. And LGBTQ youth experience homelessness for a variety of reasons, including that intersection of homophobia, transphobia, poverty, and failed systems. But according to some service providers, like the True Colors Fund of New York, the majority of LGBTQ youth are homeless due to identity-based family rejection. So if you look at these bars here, we have at the top, LGBTQ, so referencing sexual orientation, and then transgender referencing gender identity. The pink bar are youth who had to experience homelessness due to being forced out or running away due to rejection from their family members. So almost 80% due to sexual orientation and 85% of transgender youth being rejected by their family. So these are the youth that we are often working with, right? Those are staggering statistics of harm, and that I want to move on to just like how we can help, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about some ideas I have, and then we're going to dive into some case specific questions. I'll give a few examples, and then we're also going to turn it over to Jamie. So how can we help? We have just something, a lot of this I've referenced throughout, but I like to kind of condense it into some steps here. But checking our own assumptions and being mindful of language. So really being that ally, having patience, not just with other people, but yourself, right? Be willing to learn on your own. Like, this course is great. I'm so glad y'all are here. But there's so many more conversations happening outside of this. I'm going to give you a resource kit at the end that I often recommend taking like a picture of and looking up some of these websites or doing some research on your own. But really, it's important for you to confront your own biases and listen more than you talk, right? But then also speaking up to people who are perpetuating those harmful stereotypes or statements. Here I have Oliver saying, "My allies hold themselves and others accountable." And then it's important to provide self welcoming and affirming context. So we want our personal and professional spaces to recognize and honor the dignity of everyone's lived experience, right? So really knowing that we are creating a safe space, saying that that person is welcome here. My hope is to get KVC to the point where we can have one of these badges right here, Human Rights Campaign Foundation, presented by All Children, All Families, so that we can truly put kind of our actions behind our statements and really making sure that all folks feel welcomed and respected. Here, my allies love me for who I am. It's important for us to be an effective trans ally. And so some ideas on that are not using transphobic words or language, such as saying, well, what's your real name? Or how were you born? And then not outing somebody, letting somebody's gender identity be personal and recognizing that they come out. That means that we are a trusted source and we want to check in with them before telling anyone else. And that I think it was really impactful what Ryan Sallin said in his video earlier, that even sometimes he messes up, right? Like, and if we're unsure, it's just say, oh, like, I don't want to offend you. I just wanted to know what your pronouns are. What are your preferred pronouns? And or how do you want me to introduce you to other people? I think that that can be really it's so important to the people that it's so important to, right? So just asking, and then if we mess up, don't make it about you, right? Just say, oh, sorry, and then move on. Don't dwell on it. Don't make that person do emotional labor for you to help you feel better for messing up. Just say, I used the wrong pronoun earlier. I'm learning. I'm working on it. I'm going to do better. Like, continue to do better. And then just showing your support, challenging transphobia when you see it. This last thing at the bottom, I think it's important also to remember. I didn't dwell on this too much earlier, but gender identity is not sexual identity, or sexual orientation. So these are two separate ways in which a person can identify and share, and that is still very personal and private. Chris says here, my allies amplify my voice. And one of the last ideas here is be an informed trans advocate. So not just an ally, not somebody who just stands alongside, but being an advocate. Making that like ally version of verb, doing something, making change. There's a lot of ways in which you can do this. Doing your own homework, apologizing when you make a mistake, and checking your privilege, checking the ways in which being cisgender allows you to access bathrooms, healthcare, transcripts, legal documents. If you were part of the introduction to LGBTQ competency training that I also do, that I mentioned earlier, is more comprehensive. I have tons more statistics where I talk about how many transgender individuals are turned away from healthcare, from mental health providers, who don't even try to go to doctors, who don't even tell doctors certain information because of the staggering statistics on how they are rejected and denied care. I mean, it's like 50 to 70%, 52 to 76% of transgender individuals are denied care from doctors and mental health providers when in office with insurance, right? And so that's a high statistics for individuals who have insurance when there's so many individuals who do not. it's incredibly expensive and difficult to change your legal documentation, your IDs. It takes a long time. So there's a lot of ways in which individuals have these barriers that we want to be aware of and know. And there's a lot of different ways to support. So being alongside, standing in front in case that you want them to avoid hurt and harm, but also taking a step back so that you can support somebody in recognizing that they are the experts in their own lives and only that person knows what it is to be them. So that's where it is about not outing someone, recognizing if they are safe. Last here from GLSCN is JP says, my allies speak up against bigotry even when I'm not around. Kind of frameworks for how we can move forward. There's a lot of ways in which we can get involved with our local politics, our national politics, our local community centers, LGBTQ centers. But I know that is not necessarily where this training is going. Like focusing on your own language, your own biases, and how you communicate to others shows that you are honoring the dignity and respecting that individual's lived experience. And so I think that's really crucial to remember that. That we can do that work, that we are here to reduce those statistics of harm and oppression. I have here a quote from Brian Samuels, former commissioner of the U.S. Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. It says, once a young person is LGBTQ enters the foster care system, their caseworker is an important link to support and safety. It is therefore critical that a young person's caseworker has the capacity, understanding, and willingness to support the child's social and emotional development while in foster care. So that's all of us. We're here, we're uniquely positioned to support that and provide that capacity. So I have a few examples I'm going to provide, and then I'm going to give the opportunity for Jamie to speak, as well as case-specific questions or client-specific questions that y'all might have in your current position. But I'm hoping that some of these examples can answer some of those questions, I guess. So first, I just have here, I will follow the youth lead on recognizing their capacity for safety and outness. And so this can vary a lot, but one example I can give is in working with a youth who identified as male and used a masculine sounding name, presenting name within the school district. So I worked with this youth and the youth caseworker at his school to make sure that he was able to use his name and pronouns and be recognized as such throughout the day with school teachers, with staff, administration, and everything. However, I also believe the caseworker and I believed the youth when the youth said that he would be kicked out of his home and or had the cops called on him if his parents found out, right? So with the bus driver as well as the mom, we only used his birth name, which could be referred to as more feminine sounding. It was important that the bus driver, who sometimes was somebody different, right, showing up, only had access to that birth name, so that way the bus driver wouldn't accidentally out the youth, right? So this was something that we had to be really patient and careful with because we use different names in different settings, but we followed the youth's lead on recognizing where they were safe and where they would be, what kind of harm they would be if they were outed. So that's just one example. Other ways we can address language in case plans or plan of care meetings or documentation in court reports, any of those kinds of official documentation. I am of the mindset where I know that legal names are required for some of those legal documentation. However, there's lots of ways in which we can be creative with that, right? So in parentheses or in quotation marks, adding the name that the youth prefers to go by or the youth has chosen to go by, as long as that youth has said that that is okay. I've asked different youth before, gender nonconforming youth, I'll call them the letter C. C has said, like, yes, put it on, all my documentation. I want everyone to know. I'll stand up in court. I'll tell them I use they, them pronouns. Where I've worked with another youth who was like, no, I don't want that documented. I don't want that to come back on me. I just want you to use that. So, just really recognizing like where that's important to be used. And so I have put in my documentation, in case plans, plan of care meetings, court reports, etc. I have written, youths refer to youth will be referred to as like C, and uses they/them pronouns, which will be reflected in the rest of this document. So putting that kind of at the beginning, and then spell checking, grammar checking, right, and making sure that all my pronouns match what I said they would. And that is just one way that you can. I had a therapist email me about C and say, his treatment plan is attached. If you could sign it and send it back to me, like as their case manager. So I actually, sent back to this therapist and I said, C uses C's name, and they, them pronouns, which is not reflected in your treatment plan. I said, in order to not alienate and offend your clientele, you can look for updated, appropriate language here. And I gave them a link to the Human Rights Campaign, All Children's, All Family. I said, and in the treatment plan, the therapist had also said that the youth wanted to talk about being transgendered with the ED at the end. I said, this is outdated language. I said, furthermore, it's harmful that you're forcing this young person to sign documentation that uses the wrong pronouns and their legal birth name that they do not use in their daily lives. And I suggested how they might update their document, even if it is legal. So if your company requires you to use this, you can still put preferred name in parentheses or quotation marks, as well as preferred pronouns. So those are some examples that I like to give, just because that seems to be one of the number one questions I get. Other ways that, we can help is the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. I know that we're, at least on the KBC Kansas side, we are required to do this on intake, and then with so the CSSRS doesn't actually have like a separate subset for LGBTQIA individuals. However, because we know of the high number of statistics of individuals who experience family-based rejection, societal rejection, shaming, and lack of support, it's important that we're offering this resource and following up with necessary safety plans or treatment plans. And lastly, and I already mentioned this, one of the ideas I often present as being really helpful for youth is introducing ourselves with a pronoun preference, and or including it on our email signature line. And that way it helps just show that we have capacity to listen to someone, trust someone, even if they might not, tell us their preferred pronouns or might not, give us kind of access to that personal side of them until later. I think it's important for us to continue to offer that space of safety and nuance. So like in a case plan, I've even said like, hi, my name is Sansara Owens. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I will be facilitating today's case plan, and everybody can go around and introduce themselves. I did not specifically tell people to say their pronouns, but a couple people listened to me, modeled my language, and did that, right? During that case plan, same youth I used earlier, C, who's actually somebody I still connect with. I was invited to their graduation party, and they are really excited that I'm using their examples as part of their training. I did get permission from them. But in that case plan, we had an incident where the mother started crying and said, why do you keep referencing C with that name? That's not her name. Her name is this. Like, why do you keep doing that? Like, that's not what we named her. And so I was able to listen and validate and said, I understand that. I hear you. However, I believe in the right to self determination. And because C has told me they are named C and their preferred pronouns are they, them, I am going to honor that. Just as though I would honor you if you told me your nickname was a certain nickname, I would call you that. um, you and C have determined what is appropriate for you as a parent to say, but I'm going to respect C's name and pronoun. Thankfully, that was able to de-escalate. I know that there are situations where that does not de-escalate things, but that was helpful for me and showing kind of the way for the parents to listen to me, right, and trust that I wanted what was best for their young person. Later in the case, I see asked me to ask their parents to use their pronoun, and mom flat out refused, and dad said, and so I had that conversation. C wanted my help, wanted to sit there with me, but wanted me to present the conversation. And dad was like, okay, like, I don't really know how to do it, but I'm going to try. And like, is that okay? And C really felt comfortable then responding, like, yeah, that's okay. We'll practice with you. Like, we'll support you in it. So there's a lot of like growth and beauty that can be had in these moments, where with mom, who flat out refused, I asked if I could give her some articles and some research. And I gave her some articles about specifically from parents of gender nonconforming or transgender youth who explained their process with how to come, quote unquote, to terms with kind of their child changing genders, or changing names, changing pronouns. And that was it. Instead of giving her research and statistics, I gave her examples of parents. There's a lot of really great even examples from religious parents, ministers, pastors, talking about working through their own personal shame or fear to understand and adapt. So that's a lot of me talking. I think I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. I'm going to this video off for a moment and come back and bring Jamie on, so that way we can have hear from Jamie first, and then open up kind of for either for Jamie or myself about client specific, case specific, or just theoretical, right? Like, well, what do we do when dot dot dot? And then I'm gonna pop back to the presentation and show you the resources list so that you can take a picture of it, and then my email as well, so you can reach out to me.
Hello. So again, my name's Jamie. As I told you a little bit earlier, I've had many years of experience working with transgender people, both parents, youth. I worked at, I work with youth in several different capacities. So essentially, right now, I'm an individual and family counselor out in Wheeling, Illinois. But I've also worked in summer camps that have been gender inclusive. So there's been a lot of youth who have identified as transgender in that camp, slowly come out to us throughout the years. And so we've kind of been there to really hope to kind of help them navigate that, but also just create a more welcoming environment for them to just come have fun, which is, the entire intent of them coming into camp. So, Saint Sarah, thank you for the amazing presentation. It's like, oh, there's so many thoughts I have. I guess like some of the things that I want to share a little bit about before we kind of open up things to like broader questions or like additional conversations. I'm so sorry. That is my crisis phone. Social worker duty, right? So that was a spam call. So I see Sansara's face panic that I just muted a crisis phone, but that was a spam call. So some things, yeah, with my agency, we actually have adapted our paperwork a little bit to include the questions about pronouns. Essentially, on our first page of our intake packet, it asks for like in all of the information about like name, location, where they're like what township they're in. It also asks what pronouns they're using. I, as an intake like worker, because I also do intake sometimes, I don't like to ask that question when parents are around. I know some people feel a little bit more comfortable with it, but I, knowing how some parents react, and just the fact that a lot of parents might not know, I generally like to leave those questions for later whenever parents are out of the room. So generally in our assessment process, there's a large section where I do have to ask parents to leave the room if the child is over the age of 12, just so that I can get a little bit more information about any issues with like sexual or physical abuse, but also like medical chemical history. So if they're using substances, they can talk about it in an open space without the pressure of parents kind of looking at them. So in that, I kind of like to ask a little bit more questions about sexual history, but also just like their pronouns, like what they use, if in case there's anything that they don't feel comfortable talking about in front of their parents. I have a lot of, it's kind of like a split within my agency where I have a lot of families who are very accepting of their child and want to be there and do what they can to help them feel really supported and seen and understood. And then there's another half of a large amount of parents who are like, absolutely not. That doesn't make any sense. That's not my child. This is just part of like their depression. They're crazy, and so like we get into a lot of really harmful conversations there, where it's like, they're very frustrated and hurt, and they don't understand. And a lot of that, it's like we just have to find the ways that we can best support the kids so that their parents, you know, like one for their parents to like start understanding more, but also just to help really like make sure that teens are being seen. It's a lot of like what Sansara said. It's like yes, there's so many people who aren't accepted, and so they self harm, they self medicate, their suicidal ideation like is exacerbated through all of this. And so we want to try to make sure that we are at least serving as one place so they can openly be themselves while either they're exploring that or are like firmly expressing themselves in that way. Um, I to give a little bit more of like my own personal information. So I actually came out of work last fall. Yeah, wow, it feels like forever ago. But yeah, I came out, I think, in October, and it has been a bit of a roller coaster where a lot of it has been mirrored with like within the work that I've been doing with my own youth, and so pretty much what I'm trying to say is some people have been really accepting and some people have been really not. So, my all of my coworkers have been really great. I think that I have received some of the intrusive questions that Sansara illustrated earlier on in the presentation of stuff like then who do you date and then so what kind of surgeries are you getting? That a little bit more has come from family members, but it still also pops up within my close coworkers. We're a very small agency, and so sometimes it has this very strong family feel, and so I think that that's kind of where the lines get blurred a little bit. But we've had a lot of conversations about what's appropriate, what's not. In terms of my own caseload, though, I've been able to openly speak about my identity with the youth. Just to like really be transparent. I have started like a medical transition, so I'm on hormones to like masculinizing hormones. So I'm doing testosterone injections weekly, and since New Year's, pretty much. And so we're at a point where it's pretty obvious that things are a little bit different. My voice is significantly different than what it was back in December. It's kind of hard to walk like tiptoe around it. At first, people were like, "You sound sick," and then now it's like, "Oh, your voice is very different." So there've been a lot of open conversations where youth or their parents have been asking me things, and I've set up boundaries to say like, "Okay, I'm okay answering this question and this question, but not that one." Just sort of being able to say like, I'm really not comfortable giving you that kind of information, but I really appreciate if you just respect that my pronouns are he, him, or they. And so been able to do that. Now, on the alternative, when we're starting to talk a little bit more about that side of my caseload, that is a little bit not as that is very much not as accepting of transgender people or just like LGBT people in general. those are situations where I haven't really been able to disclose. And it's pretty obvious. There's still a lot of things happening here that are very different from like when their kids started. The kids are noticing, but we don't talk about it just for the sake of safety. I've actually had kids come in and talk about how they've beaten up kids at school because they seem gay, or say really like transphobic comments towards like other people or about other people, or just like make those jokes in front of me. Clinically, like as a therapist, like I'm doing therapy with them. I'm not the kind of person who's like I'm going to correct you on this, but I want you to let you know that like hi, I'm sitting in front of you. A lot of these conversations don't get extended to parents because parents, right? A little bit in the continuing conversation of like they're very much not accepting. And so I try to walk the line of what's clinically appropriate and what's not. And for them, it's really more of like we're not touching it as long as your kid is getting adequate therapy. That's the most important. Because at the end of the day, what their beliefs or like what I'm saying or what my ideology is, like that stays outside of the room. I think that when it comes to like respect and being I don't know, just like maintaining my own safety, that's when comments come out. It hasn't gotten to that necessarily. I think that respect has become a question a little bit sometimes, and that's when things are addressed. But for the most part, otherwise, it's untouched. It's kind of like asking, "So, therapist, where do you live?" And it's like, well, that's a little bit more like, I don't. We're not going to talk about that. Do you really need to know how many kids your therapist has? Probably not. That sort of thing. That kind of like falls within the bubble of like, that's okay. You don't really need to talk about it right now. So there's that. That's the big part of it. I'm open to asking or receiving any questions that you all have about, my experience or just like what I've seen with kids. I know that you all aren't doing the individual therapy in that sense, but like you're all doing really important work, and I want to be able to help you as you navigate through some of the nuances of it. And I know that for a lot of it, it's like kind of have to be in it to know what you want to ask. But I think that through this presentation, it's it's generated a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions, and I know that generally these kinds of questions or these conversations are really difficult to have because you're worried about hurting people's feelings. I'm giving you the opportunity to ask the uncomfortable questions because I'm open to receiving them. So yeah.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, I want to echo that, just like how we started this presentation, where this is meant to be a learning space, a workshop, a facilitation of space where often I'm doing this on my own, so that I can have some of these uncomfortable conversations. And so I'm really grateful for Jamie to be a part of that as well. So would love to open up to both conference rooms, any kind of questions. So it could be about the presentation, it could be about a case you have, it could be to either one of us. You don't have to designate, but we just love to hear some questions. Like we specifically geared this training to have some time for some of these like questions and conversation, because you might not have other spaces to have this conversation within. So we'd love to hear from anyone. I know y'all have thoughts and questions.
Okay. This is KBC Niles. I think we have a question.
Awesome, thank you.
And how do you support staff in overcoming their own biases and opinions in reference to um, LGBTQ?
That is, yeah, don't worry. I know you. Sometimes we just say LGBT plus, right? All the letters. That is a really great question. I love that question, and I kind of wish I had a slide from my introduction to LGBTQ competency training in here, because that is something that I think it's really important for us as allies and advocates to stand up. And so to really just challenge some of those conversations. So it depends on your relationship with the person speaking, of course, right? So like, I think I mentioned earlier that once I said to somebody, I said, how interesting that you're arguing grammar over the dignity and worth of a young person. I felt like it was my role to stick up for that kid because this was a transition coordinator who spent a lot of time with that youth, and the youth's family. So I was willing to kind of take that hit, so to speak, of like, wow, you're being kind of aggressive with this. That's so interesting. You don't care about this young person, because then all of a sudden they're like, but I do care. And then it's like, oh, okay, well then why aren't you honoring their name and pronoun? But there's also lots of conversations that can be had. You can always look up a few things, how to respond to people when they say that's so gay. And I think that's one of the easiest ones to look up, because there's a lot of things that say, there's like a whole campaign called You Don't Say campaign that has really great examples, where it says, things like, it's like, oh, well, I don't use that word because I would never want to make somebody feel uncomfortable. Like, that's not what I'm about. Or like, I would never use a slang word or a derogatory term when somebody uses that, because I wouldn't want to use a word that reflects the pain and suffering of others. Or just saying like, I don't say that, because I don't ever want to be in a position where I hurt people. Or you can go the direction of this, like, I used to think that too. Or like, I used to wonder, am I using the right language? But then I took this training, or I read this article, and wow, did you know that, LGBT kids are 6 to 8 times more likely to commit suicide from being rejected from their family? Like, I don't want to be a part of that, right? So there's like a couple different ways you can take that approach depending on your relationship. I think one of the biggest ways is just modeling the right language. Like, I had a former supervisor who, with the young person on my caseload, C, would always refer to them with the wrong pronoun. And even though we'd had multiple conversations all the time, right? And so then I would just say, yes, they want to do this. And then the supervisor would be like, dang it, I did it again, didn't I? And it's like, it's okay, we're learning together, right? Like, we're working on it together. And it's really important that we're reflecting proper pronouns no matter who we're talking to, not just around a young person, not just in front of them, right? That we're always modeling that. Jamie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think what you said about really keeping in mind who you're talking to is really important. Because like, even in like my experience, like, kind of like I was telling you, I'm not like, I can't really police language too much in therapy, because it's supposed to be this space where people should feel comfortable to just say whatever. But if I'm like in a group and all the kids are hanging out, it's like, I address it face, like, just like really directly, where I'm like, oh wow, I didn't know that that person was a homosexual. And they're like, no, that's not what I meant by gay. I'm like, oh, so then what do you mean by that? And it's like, we need to start using words that actually mean the thing that we're using, and not things that can lead to other, bigger meanings, where it's like, you saying this has this connotation. So if you mean stupid, say stupid, right? Um, Instead of like doing this. But also, like, let's not talk negatively about other people who are in group, right? And so it's just like it's a larger thing. But yeah.
Is that helpful, or are you thinking about anything in particular, perhaps? Because I know that sometimes coworkers are sometimes our most negative Nancy's about our cases, right? Like, sometimes as social workers, we need to vent, we need to talk, but then there comes that line where it's like, wait, don't bash my client, or don't put the client down. And I think it's really important that we're using, and you all know this, right? To use person-centered language and strengths-based language, right? So it's like talking about that young person who, like, think about that activity we had where all 5 things that we had to cross off the list, right? So if we get a young person in our residential facility who is quote unquote a problem, it's like remembering what brought them there, right? What traumas brought them there, which we already think about, but what due to their identity, what traumas due to their identity and rejection around their identity are they also carrying with them? Are they also assuming that you're going to be a part of? And so really helping staff kind of remember that. Like, yeah, this is carrying a lot, not just this, but also like you keep using the wrong pronoun. And I think that probably is really offensive and alienating. Like, I learned about it. It's facts, whatever that is. So, jump in with the questions. Yeah.
I think that opens like a really good window for people to like have this opportunity to really self-reflect as well. Or it's like something that I ask myself often as a therapist, or just like as a social worker, is why am I getting mad right now? Like I'm supposed to be helping this person, but I'm so mad and I don't know why. It's like, well, why? Why am I like realistically speaking in this situation, what's making me super upset about what's happening? Right. Okay. So maybe the way that this person in like my space is not reacting the best way that I want them to, or they're getting aggressive, or they're just not like, they're not hearing me and I'm telling them to do this thing and they're just not doing it. Right. And at the end of the day, it's like, well, what am I really mad about? Am I mad about that? Or did something else happen to me before? Or does it mean something else to me that I'm mad about it? But I think, and in the sense of like, in terms of pronouns, it's like, why am I getting really mad when people correct me? Um, what is the thing that's really like deep in there that's frustrating me? Is it because I'm wrong and I don't like being wrong? Do I hate when people correct me? Maybe, but or it's something that's like it's the anger is really just like confusion because I'm learning. It could be all of the different things at once or just one thing, but I think self reflection is a really big part of it as well.
Any either response to that or more questions that are coming up?
Okay, so to go off that point that we just talked about, so there's different challenges that happen, right? So you can have a young lady come in with transgender and she identifies how you use the correct pronoun.
I can't fully hear you. I don't know if someone closer to the mic might want to repeat the question. I heard if you have a young lady come in, and that's about all I heard.
Okay, so you have a young lady who comes in. She identifies as she, as a transgender, correct? So that's more, staff are more receptive to that young lady coming in versus have a gentleman who comes in and he's identifying as now he initially presented himself as he that the transition of him initially being a he now is identifying as a she. And so that's our obstacle in trying to educate staff how to be receptive and accept she for who she is versus looking at she as a he. I hope I said that correctly. Okay.
So just a couple like gentle nudges on language. So when we're talking about, and like I said, this is a good space to have these questions, and so you're not the only one having these questions, So I'm really appreciative. So I hope I said that right. So we wouldn't ever like refer to someone as a transgender. So just really like someone who identifies as transgender. Or someone who uses she, her, or he pronouns. So saying uses pronouns or then identifies as transgender. So just like I said, gentle nudge on language because we're all figuring this out together, right? So I think what you're asking is somebody who comes in who maybe identifies as a trans woman and says she uses she pronoun. It's a little easier to understand and kind of roll with that than with somebody who maybe initially identifies as male, uses he, him pronouns, but then starts to transition. How do you kind of adapt? Is that the question? There's some like fuzziness, so I missed a few words.
That's the question, because now we have to support the staff as well as the client, and then the peers on the dorm as that individual makes that transition. And there's a lot of dynamics there that we have to navigate, making sure that the peers are respectful of that person's wishes, as well as the staff being respectful as well.
Yeah, I love this question because part of it is that there's no right answer. But the other part is this where all of you in this room and your supervisor and your director really come into play, right? This is where you say, like, I think we need to have a team meeting on how to approach this, because every young person's experience is going to be so different, right? I've worked with transgender youth who are like, yeah, I'm transgender, like, this is who I am. And I've also worked with youth who said, like, I had a youth who told me they were pre-trans. I'd never heard that before, you know, and I love that. I love the youth's ability to just play with language and try new things, right? So it depends on where the youth is at. So it's like, okay, are you ready to tell people? Like, because we have to have a conversation about safety, about the group, about your peers, about the staff. Like, are you ready for me to help you have those conversations, right? So then really putting yourself, asking for that consent, asking for that, you know, privileged information, or saying, I've worked with youth where it says, I've said, can I have this conversation with a couple of like our support team, and then we'll come back to you and come to you with some ideas. Where like some youth might be like, yeah, I want to have a group sit down with all the peers in my dorm and say, like, I'm working on transitioning, my pronouns are this, you know, are now this, and now we're going to work towards moving me towards a different ward. But like, I don't know what your protocols and, you know, KVC protocol is at. I think we're kind of figuring it out now. Like, this is a really important time for us to be having these conversations, because more youth are being out as transgender or gender nonconforming. So, but it's so specific to the youth on who they can share a room with, what ward they're in, what level they're at in the conversation. If they're willing and able to have a conversation about pronouns and safety and all of those things. So I think it's a great thing you're asking this, and I think it's a really good opportunity for you to ask your supervisor or director and say, like, hey, what is protocol? Or like, can we have a gender affirming? That is something that I like to use, and often people in our positions use gender affirming therapy, gender affirming language, right? So we want to be supportive and affirm their gender. And so how do we have gender affirming apparatuses? So that question is going to be very specific to the youth and your facility. But I hope your supervisor's in the room, because I'm sending y'all to them to ask these questions of like, what is our protocol? Can we have a meeting with staff and a meeting with youth? How do we approach this? But it also really have to involve the young person. And I just want to note that sometimes we think, oh, the young person's not ready, or the young person, that's too much to ask for the young person. Think how powerful think of those statistics that we have, right? How many transgender individuals are assaulted, physically, sexually assaulted, who are evicted, who are homeless, who are rejected by their parents. LGBTQ youth, while they're 76% more likely to be rejected by their biological parents, did you know that it's 82%, I believe, I could be a little off on that statistic, that foster parents are also kicking them out due to their identity. So it's like they're constantly feeling these senses from society and TV and articles and caseworkers and school that they are not good enough. So we want to, when we get to present, like, hey, I got a support team that wants to back you up, we got to work out a few things. I think predominantly those youth are going to feel supported and included in that conversation, and I think that's probably the biggest support that we could have and be. I hope that kind of answered it.
You did.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Yes. Well, one more.
Okay.
well, it's just two questions. The first one is, we know you this we're coming into Niles now. We're getting clients as such. However, they're already experiencing trauma. We have kids here with trauma. How what is the it seems like it'd be a challenge trying to incorporate, I mean, the treatment, are we equipped with the specific treatment for those individuals? And I hope I know I'm using certain terminology, but really my question is, um, we have kids here that already, you know, they don't understand, and then it's a challenge as a staff. I'm a direct staff. Um, that and you certainly have staff that have compromising issues, but to me personally, that shouldn't be an issue because you treat everybody with respect. It's not, based on um, what color they are, what they identify themselves as, just based on respect, and then being educated. Additionally, because I think that's a big part of the picture also. And that was the second part of the question. Will we be getting additional training? But it appears to me that it's a big challenge, and we have kids from all backgrounds of experience of different trauma, and then we vacillate the kids in between one unit to another one to adapt to their identity or the availability of staff. It just seems real challenging, and I'm wondering, is this a trend that facilities are going to in general, or
Yeah, great questions. So I think that the idea of us providing trauma informed care, right, as a company or an agency, is that I wish it were as simple as one training or one textbook, and y'all know the trainings never end, right? So we're always updating, we're always adapting on what is the best, informed practice, trauma informed practice. So one size does not fit all, right? So it is going to adapt per child, per facility rules, per protocol, per trauma experience. But just like we have areas, I mean, right now our country is at this precipitous moment where we're talking a lot about race, right? And so if you think about that, where we're having these conversations where we're identifying where maybe trauma informed practice isn't also including race, or what a young person might experience, prejudices and oppression that a young person's experiencing, our practices don't always align for that. So there's going to be individuals on our wards or in our groups that are triggered by the person sitting across from them just for their very existence, right? It could be their eye color, it could be their skin color, it could be their gender identity. So as workers, we're always adapting to that. And that's why this training, which right now I'm so grateful, like we were asked to do for Niles and Hayes, and I'll be available to do as many trainings as people want, because I think this is a really important conversation to continue having, is that we have to keep doing these trainings, keep having these conversations, do your own research and knowledge gathering, or ask your supervisor, like, I need more resources on this. Like, I don't know how to approach this young person, or I don't know how to approach this colleague on this, because that's the same as any topic we're approached on. So I think that's a really good question, because we are going to continuously have to adapt and work on that, and get support from your other direct line staff and the people who maybe are holding the direct line staff.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions as maybe someone's popping in? I might turn off my video, and Jamie, you're welcome to as well. And I'm going to just pop up the resources sheet, just so that people can either screen cap it or take a picture of it, just so that you can use that to do some of your own research. But I would still love for anybody to share their question while I pull that up. And so here are just some resources that I pulled some of our from. All Children's All Families specifically is from Human Rights Campaign that talks about child welfare. But Human Rights Campaign has a ton of newsletters and resources. The Safe Zone has a lot of information. These two bottom ones, the Child Welfare Gateway and not Children's Mercy, I'm sorry. Child Welfare Gateway has a lot more trainings, videos, toolkits, etc. PFLAG is for parents or loved ones of individuals who are LGBTQ, including a transgender group. So that could be a really great resource for parents and caregivers. Same with Straight for Equality. All of these have just really great resources. The Trevor Project has a lot more information that is really digestible, but also a suicide hotline and chat line. And Trans Lifeline is one of the only trans-led trans support groups and suicide hotlines as well. So again, here's just some resources, but I'd love to hear any questions while we're in our last couple minutes.